Hey everyone, welcome to the BusyBusy webinar series. Today's webinar is on job costing, how to improve profit and stabilize your business. Normally we like to give everybody about 90 seconds to join. We've got a lot of people signed up for this webinar, and so we'll hold tight for about 90 seconds here, let people flood in, and then we'll get started. Looks like we've still got people coming in, and so we'll give it about 30 more seconds here and let people continue to join, and then we'll get started. Disabled. Let me undisable it. Click on the three lines. What? You want everyone? Attendees can chat. No. Okay. One little technical difficulty there, just making sure our chat was set up so that we could do our Q&A section. We will get started. Welcome everybody to the job costing webinar. Couple of things, as I just barely mentioned, we do have a chat. So if there's any questions that you have, don't feel like you have to wait until the end of the webinar to ask the questions. You're welcome to submit those whenever. If we get a chance to ask those questions during the webinar, I will definitely try to do so. You're more than welcome to send them during. There will be a series of questions I'll be asking Isaac throughout, but if I don't get to them during the webinar, we'll definitely have a Q&A at the end. So excited to get started today. We're excited to have Isaac join us. So give an introduction here with Isaac. I read the bio. Isaac, I'm actually not going to read this to the group. If they want to read it, that's fine. I feel like whoever wrote it was probably being a little bit modest, so I'm going to give you my own introduction. I've known Isaac for about 10 years. Isaac and I met way before I worked at BusyBusy. I ended up actually investing in BusyBusy because of Isaac's vision for what he could do for the construction industry. But I've known Isaac when he owned multiple construction companies, which he still does. He's also a developer of $1 billion project in southern Utah. He owns a tech company, being BusyBusy, and is the founder and CEO of that company. So understanding allocation of resources, understanding job costing from a construction standpoint is really what put him in a position to start branching out into these other areas as he's been successful inside of the construction industry. So a good authority for everybody to be able to collaborate with today, learn from, and we're excited to be able to have him on the webinar. So as we jump into the slides, this is always a polarizing topic to get started with. It's something that when we do this particular topic and have a conversation around the recession of 2008, it's always more fun in person because you get to ask the question, okay, who here had a business in the 90s and was around in the early 2000s and had a chance to benefit from those good times and be part of that bull market, and then who went through the 2008 recession. We can't see a raise of hands here, but I think nonetheless asking that and having people have an awareness of What have they been through? What have they seen? Why does that even matter? Regardless of, are we going to be in a recession that actually impacts construction or not? Luckily for us, COVID didn't really impact construction for the majority of the trades. Is this current recession that we're in that's affecting other markets, is it going to affect construction, is something worth asking. But I think for me, and the reason that this topic is really important to address here, is it also helps people understand more of your story, Isaac, why job costing matters, how was BusyBusy created, why was it created? Because BusyBusy was created out of the 2008 recession as what Isaac identified as a necessity. So Isaac, if you could speak a little bit to that, help everybody understand why you felt like job costing was so important as you navigated the Great Recession of 2008.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these topics today we're talking about were really based on, a lot of lessons learned in that recession. And to me, I've grown up always being very analytical, and always thought I ran a pretty good business. And I know a lot of our people who are attending this webinar probably feel the same. We're really analytical. We feel like we run a really good business. And yet somehow the 2008 recession caught me, you might say, it caught a lot of us, caught us with our pants down. Like, we were completely blindsided by it, because all the norms that we had dealt with before kind of blew us away. We'd never seen something like that before, where you have your systems and processes and your businesses going on, and then all of a sudden you just hit a cliff, and the recession hits hard. And that's an extreme example, but it has a lot of great lessons learned that you can apply to today. And so that's some of the stuff I want to talk about today. And it did inspire BusyBusy. I realized back then that we didn't understand our business well enough. We didn't understand the costs involved in our business and how to manage it in the way that we should manage it. We should have been able to have reactionary plans, plans in place of how to respond when the recession hit. So yeah, to me, the 2008 recession left a deep scar.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thanks for the context there. And moving into, so we've got 5 bullet points that were in the email. Those 5 bullet points we want to get into and make sure that we address each of them. That's what people came here to understand a little bit more about. So the first one that you had written down is the 5 bullet points that you pulled out of that people should care about with job costing. Know how much money you have control over in a job. Now, I've heard you talk about this before. It's something that we talk about internally in regards to how we can continue to help contractors invest in their business, understand their profit, improve their profit. So I'm assuming what you're talking about here is the profitability of the job. That's the money that you have control over. If I'm wrong, please correct me. If I'm accurate, please expound on that so that everybody here can understand a little bit more about what you're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am talking about more than just profits. I'm saying what part of your job, what part of the money in your job does your decisions on that job site and your performance have control over? And so if you take a job, you take a typical contractor, you're going to take out of it the materials and the subcontractor portion of that contract. So let's say you have $1 million contract and you have 500,000 of that is in your materials price, and you have another $100,000 that's vendors that you're paying for. So these are other people doing work for you or other suppliers supplying you. You really don't have control over that money. That's money that you've got to just automatically take off the top. So now you're left with $400,000, and in that $400,000, you've got to pay for your manpower, your labor, your office overhead. That's where you're going to get your profits from. If you have an equipment company like I did in excavation, that's where you're paying your equipment payments and your fuel and all your other things. And so the reason I push on that really hard is because a lot of times as contractors, we look at the gross volume dollar of a project and we say, wow, this is $1 million project. Like, that's a lot of money. And so a contractor can say, well, can you drop 10%? Like your slide says, can you just come down 10%? I had an exact experience of this in the recession where we had bid a job and it was in really tight times. There was just nothing left on the bone, no meat left on the bone. We bid it for about $260,000. and they didn't start the job for 9 months. And this is one of the weaknesses that happens as we bid a project, and in lean times especially, and this happens today in high times too. We bid a project, it doesn't get started for 9 months after the bid, and things have changed. And so in my case, this is tight times, everybody wants work. I bid it for $260,000, and by the time the job had started, the contractor reached out to me for me to up my bid, and I upped it, I think around $50,000 or $60,000. So I'll use 50 as an example. So I upped it $50,000, and the contractor was livid pissed at me. He's like, the entire project, this is a $3 million building, Isaac. The entire project has gone up by $3 million or $3,000 aside from you. And then you individually, you, the excavator, and I was the excavator on this project, went up by 50,000. And so he was saying, can't you just drop your bid 10%? Like you can do that. Like, these are lean times. We're all trying to get this work going. We're trying to make this job happen. You can drop your bid by 10%. And I said, no, there's no way I can do that. I said, after I pay, the reason my price went up is because fuel had gone up at the time, and my subs and suppliers had raised their prices by the difference of that $50,000. And all I had in the job that I had control over was $60,000. That's all I had. And so I had $60,000 to pay for my labor and my materials. I'm sorry, that's wrong. I had $60,000 after I had paid for my labor and my materials. So 60,000 is all I had control over. And so when he's asking me to drop 10%, if you were asking me to drop 10% on the 60,000, well, that's a big difference, right? And that's all you should think about when someone says a statement like that to you. But when he's asking me to drop 10% on the job ended up being close to $300,000. He's asking me to cut 50% of the cash I have control over. And that's what I have to pay my people and to pay equipment payments, overhead, whatever other expenses that I have in the project. And so I'm immediately going to lose money. There's just no question. Doesn't matter how tight times are, how much I want this job. This is a bad idea. And it's a real important thing when you're bidding projects and you're handing those projects off to your project managers. Make sure you differentiate very clearly what money you have control over, and it'll help you in your negotiation. And in this case, of course, I told him there's not a chance. I was actually assisting a person that was sub-bidding from me to really get this project, because I had decided to stay out of the firefight. And my friend, he was behind me saying, yeah, let's do that. Let's drop 10%. We need the work. And I said, no way, you cannot afford to do this. We're not dropping 10% because we only have control of 60,000. We might as well write this job a check as to drop 10% on this project. And so we held our ground, and we eventually, and we didn't budge, and we didn't end up losing the job either, because it was reasonable and rational. But it's one of those things you need to know, especially when you're negotiating your projects, because that's a common thing from a contractor. The quote you have there on your slide, can you just come down 10%? It is so common. And we often look at that number and say, yes, on the overall job, 10% seems like not a big deal. But if you break that down to what money you have control over, 10% can be 50% of your money, which was in my case.
Well, especially depending on the times, right? Like right now, people over the past year or two have asked, hey, can you come down 10%? And it was easy to say no, because you had 6 months, a year worth of work lined up. But 6 months from now, a year from now, things get tighter. You need the work. You want to keep your guys busy. And then someone's asking you, can you come down 10%? That's where it gets really tempting. But I love the way you frame it in. I don't want to pay someone to work for them.
Yeah, that's right. Don't pay somebody to work for them. You've got to understand these concepts in this webinar, or else you won't know what you can negotiate. Like, what is your margin of negotiation? It's usually not as big as you think it is.
Yeah. Okay, so this ties in really, really well to the next thing here, talking about a quote that we often discuss with contractors when they're adopting technology and improving profitability. One of the luxuries that we have here at BusyBusy is our customer base. We have a lot of data on this, but when they implement BusyBusy, their profits increase by 30% within the first 12 months of implementation. And so whether their business is doing extremely well before adopting or it does really well after, the conversation is always an awareness of, hey, a lot of cash covers up a lot of sins. That's something that was said by a good friend of ours. His name's Paul Campbell. He's a multimillionaire, portfolio owns a lot of different businesses. Also the owner of Wheeler Cat that distributes cat machinery through Wyoming, Nevada, and Utah. And yeah, does very, very well. And he's seen it because he's been around and run the business for, I think, 40 to 50 years in a way that he's watched people during the best of times run a business differently than they do when things are lean. I think the trick here is, how can we run a business during the best of times as though it's lean times, because then our profitability is maximized. But talk a little bit more about that. Talk about why this slide, why was this one of your bullet points, and why do people care about a lot of cash covering up a lot of sins?
This honestly is, maybe one of the most important things to me philosophically is, people often, as contractors, we often chase work. Like, if I'm doing $5 million in annual revenue, I want to do $10 million. We have a hard time saying, no, we want more work all the time. And what I often tell businesses that I consult with is, why not just want more profits? If you're doing $5 million and let's say you're making 5% profit, so you're making $250,000 a year, rather than going to $10 million in order to get $500,000 a year, what if you increase your profit margin from 5% to 10%? That, a lot of people say, well, how can I do that? And that is what this topic is all about, is oftentimes, especially in high times like we've been in lately, we have a lot of jobs rolling, we have a lot of cash coming in. And so we make big mistakes. We don't realize how much profit is being left on the table. And it is, and it's hard. Sometimes it's really hard to convince companies that they're actually doing this. Like if you're not managing your job costing, measuring what's happening in your business from job to job, you can be losing a lot of money. And if you're not identifying and incentivizing the performance of your team. And so, like I said, this one's very close to me. So I want to show an example of this. I have an excavation company that I was consulting on this project, and I had observed, their operation. I told them, look, things are not going right. You need to make some adjustments to your business and your performance. And they really had a hard time believing me. They said, no, look, we're performing right. We're making money. We are just fine. And I said, yeah, but you're losing a lot of money that you're not aware of. And so I'm going to show you a couple of videos, because what we had to do to convince this company is we had to actually go out and video their job site. And then we broke down the data from the videos that we did and showed them what was actually happening. And so the first video I'm going to show you is this one. Can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Let me know when you got my screen. Okay, so I'm going to push play here and you can start seeing. So you can see down here, you can see the machines moving, right? And it kind of looks normal. This actually looks like an average day that's happening. You can see the machines moving here. You can see the trucks rolling, right? You'd think this is actually pretty decent moving job site, okay? But there's a lot of things that you can find out from this video. First off, they're actually not moving near as fast as this appears. So as you watch this, and I'm going to speed it up a little bit to help you, watch how fast this truck is rolling back as it goes. You see the speed at which this is driving. Okay, the trick here, and this is how I showed the company. I showed them this and they said, yeah, this is about right. This looks about right. And I said, okay, I'm going to show you the different video. I said, this is not you. This is not what was happening. I had actually, on that video, I had one of my programmers speed up that time by 2 to show that video. This is actually what was happening. I apologize, 1 second here. All right, here we go. So when you actually look at the video, this is how fast these trucks were going. And as you can kind of see, they feel like they're moving in slow motion, and it feels like that to me too, that they're moving in slow motion. They did not understand that they had a performance issue on this project, because the superintendent of this project had decided that the thing that was most important is that the machines weren't damaged or weren't put in a rough environment. And so he told them, you need to keep yourself in first gear all the time, even though these machines are designed to go as high as fourth gear. And so this is how their project was operating, and they weren't tracking their loads accomplished per day. They weren't tracking their performance. And so they're just doing their job every day, and they're just doing the best they can. And I went and interviewed the general or the superintendent on site and said, hey, I think you need to track your loads. You need to do this and this. And he was an older gentleman, and he was fairly offended that I would question the way that he ran his job site. But now I'll show you one more video. So what we did is then we went back to it and said, okay, now let's speed this up even a little better. So give me 1 second here and I'll show you. Okay, so then what we did is we sped it up to 20 times. All right, now because it's 20 times, then people have the patience to actually watch it. And so what we showed them is that they were spending a lot of wait time between loading these trucks, that this excavator that's loading the trucks is spending a lot of time just waiting on the trucks to get there, and that they needed to either get their trucks in second gear or put in a third truck or something. But basically they were having poor performance, and we were able to show this and identify to them. And what we did is we demonstrated this to them, is showed them that on their project, even though they were making money, okay, because you're in high times, and this is a perfect example of a lot of cash covering up a lot of sins. Even though they were making money, they missed the opportunity. They could have made $500,000 more dollars, $500,000 more dollars on this one job site if they had just moved these trucks faster, moved the dirt faster by putting in the additional truck they need, or put them in higher gear. And honestly, in this case, they needed to do both. So we were able to identify this through wait time. Now, the same concept applies to more than just excavators. This applies to painters. This applies to scaffolding. This applies to so many different things. A lot of times you're just, you don't realize the things you're doing if you're not tracking and analyzing them, or the things you're not doing. You don't realize the profits you're missing out on. And in high times, that doesn't kill you. When you start getting into tight times, that's going to kill your business. And in high times, you're just losing the opportunity of making a lot more money, which in my opinion is really important. I mean, that's what we're in business for, is to make a lot of profit. And so you're losing that opportunity.
Just pulling that slide back up here.
To kind of relate that to some of the other users we probably have on the call here, we had worked with a company that was doing exteriors. They're doing exteriors on housing and apartments and such. And when they started tracking their job costing and tracking per task, they started realizing that they were losing money by just a misapplication of their most important labor. So they started getting their masons focused on bricklaying, and they started putting in hiring outside services to come set up their scaffolding. And again, it's just you make a lot of production mistakes when you're in high times. And so a lot of cash does cover a lot of sins, and those sins will reveal themselves when you get into tighter times and you get in more competitive times.
Yeah, and that's, so moving on to profitability, that's exactly what I was going to mention here, is one of the things that we often hear about in regards to job costing is when somebody starts to use job costing, one of the first things they see is what type of jobs they should be bidding on, what type of jobs they should not, because their team's just not very good at it. Maybe there's a competitor there in the region who just happens to do that type of work better. So every time you're getting beat on a bid, that's because they can actually do that work at a profit and you can't. Leave it alone. Do the things that you're best at. Now, there's other context there where there's certain team members and certain crews that are the very best at certain types of work, but that can relate to so many different things. We've had a client who talked about exactly what you were saying, in that they realized that so much of their skilled labor was going toward doing things like setting up scaffolding that they were losing a lot of money. And so they hired a completely separate crew, less skilled, less hourly wage, just to do scaffolding. There was a painter who similarly realized that he needed to bring people on specifically to do the taping rather than having his main painter do that, so that they could specialize in what they were doing. Because by tracking where hours were being allocated, they realized very quickly what they were doing. Electricians have said the same thing. Certain guys are better at rough, certain guys are better at finish. Also, when you realize that, hey, maybe everyone's really struggling at finish, you realize really simple documentation like taking photos once you've dropped wires down a wall can help increase that. And we've had a lot of people talk about their increase in production based on little tweaks in efficiency like that. So a lot of stuff to unwrap here. Knowing what types of jobs and tasks your team is most profitable at. Josh Bastian, another one of our clients, he's got a pretty infamous quote in saying that very quickly started rolling out BusyBusy, implemented job costing, and he realized exactly what type of jobs he wanted and what types of jobs he did not want anymore and stopped bidding on completely. But go ahead and expound more on that. You're part owner in more than 5 construction companies. How does this type of stuff impact your masonry company and these different groups outside of excavation?
So the key here, knowing the types of jobs you're making money on and what you're losing on is, again, whether you're in a growing or shrinking environment, and these challenges exist today, even in high times, because you have major labor challenges and you have skilled labor challenges. And so if you have a limited amount of skilled labor, to your point earlier about the taping or the scaffold setup, you want to focus that skilled labor on revenue producing activities, things that will make you the most money, right? But the big mistake that we make is when we're not tracking jobs, sometimes we're making 20% profit margin on some jobs, and then other jobs we're losing 15% margins. And so as a whole company, say we're making 5 or 10%, whatever the case is, but we're looking at the averages and we're saying, well, on average, I'm doing good, I'm making money. But whether you're in growth mode, you're growing or you're shrinking, if you don't know what you're winning on and what you're losing on, you can shrink or grow in the wrong direction. Even in growth mode in high times, I'm surprised at how many contractors go out of business in high times. And it's because they're not tracking these costs. And so they can say, hey, we're doing great. I'm going to keep expanding my crews and increasing my business, and they'll grow in the direction of jobs that they're actually not profitable on. And so they're losing money. And so this is one of the most important things to consider when you are growing or shrinking is where do you want to focus your activities? And, a term we often use here is revenue-based activities. Focus your skilled labor on your revenue producing activities and identify which ones you make the most money on. Back to the statement I made earlier is, would you rather be a company doing $5 million a year with 10% profit or a company doing $10 million a year with 5% profit? I would much rather the smaller one. It's a lot less headaches, a lot easier to manage and control, and makes us just as much money.
Got it. Okay, this one's a good one for those of you who took microeconomics and macroeconomics in college. This is different. Don't fall asleep on us. I took those classes too. Little different here. So
yeah.
I love this topic. This is something we were actually talking about yesterday in regards to product and looking at different things and how to, again, impact businesses, talking about resource scheduling, being able to make sure that our customers understand the scheduling portion of the product from a opportunity cost standpoint. How many times are you getting to jobs early because you're getting pressure from a GC? So you're putting 1 or 2 guys on there. How much additional travel time are you spending? Like thinking big picture in the macro scale of what you're doing resource wise for your entire company impacts the profitability of every job, because opportunity cost looms larger than I think a lot of people realize. Put a bow on that, if you will. Talk a little bit more about that and why this is so important to you and what you do with your companies.
Yeah, it's a great topic. And of course, I wish I knew the demographic of our attendees, what size of companies they manage and so forth, but I'll give you kind of the high level understanding of this. So when I say microeconomics and macroeconomics, I'm talking about what your slide says here, which is microeconomics is when you're focusing on the individual job or project. Are you profitable on each project? And your focus is right on that project, and you're managing that project, and you're managing the performance, and hopefully you're managing the performance of that project against your estimates. Okay. Macroeconomics is really thinking big picture and how your resource allocation looks for your overall company, how you're working jobs together. Your scheduling comes in big here, your scheduling of your resources, your planning, your overall margins. And so you're looking at each project as far as how much it contributes to the company. In other words, you have all these on the macroeconomic side, you have all these fixed costs. It can be you, it can be your overhead, your office, other administrative responsibilities, sales, marketing, all kinds of things. And you have to figure out how to allocate these costs to projects or have the projects contribute out of their funds to pay for these costs. Now, my experience is between large companies and small companies, large companies are usually really good at macroeconomics. And it's an amazing thing. When you're a small company, you're often really good at the micro. You're really good at running your projects. And so you say, and we said this in the past when we were small, we said, look, we are so good at our performance. I mean, we kill it. Like, we are just killing it on our performance. How is it that these big companies that perform a lot more poorly can compete with us? And it's because the big companies typically do a really great job on the macroeconomic side, and the little companies typically do a really good job on the microeconomic side. And very typically, both of them have the weakness on the other side. Little ones don't know how to run their macroeconomics as good as big ones, and big ones don't seem to run their microeconomics as good as little ones because they're not as close to the project. And so as you think of these two things, that, we could do a whole webinar on this concept of how you do this on a micro versus macro level. But I'll give you an example. When you're doing resource allocation, we had a conversation yesterday with some of the team where we talked about why, when someone does your house, I think, Derek, you gave the comparison. Why don't they bring 8 people, why doesn't the electrician bring 8 people to my house and just get it done and get out and move on? Instead, they send in a couple people, here a few days, there a few days, there a few days, and they don't typically move that well and get it done. And that's because the smaller companies typically don't manage their macro, their big picture very well. And so they're struggling with their resource scheduling. They have a harder time satisfying all their different projects because they have a hard time saying no. And this is another part of macroeconomics, is you have to learn on a macro level how to allocate, schedule, budget your resources, make sure you've got the estimates going out and the funnel coming in so that you get the jobs to keep your crews busy and productive, but not take on too much. Otherwise you start suffering on a macro level. You start suffering on your big picture projects. And so to give you an example of some of the ways to just track here, I know we want to get into some of the technicalities here. There's 2 ways you can track this to start, at least on a profitability level, seeing the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. And I guess to take a step back, the first thing I wish our customers would do or consider is to just think about these 2 things differently. If you start thinking about these 2 things differently, like I have microeconomics, which is project by project basis, am I profitable on a project by project basis? And then macroeconomics, how am I running my business? This is a good time to say, am I working in my business or am I working on my business? If you're working on your business, you're working the macroeconomics, you're working the big picture profitability of your company. The way that you can track that to see how at least your dollar allocation, and that'll start giving you visibility, is 2 different ways. So in accounting, they call it contribution. But let's say your project, let's say you've got a $100,000 project, and the labor that's going to cost you on that project, labor, materials, whatever the case is going to be $70,000. Then your contribution to the macro, to the overall company, is $30,000. So you can look at you can start managing your projects on an individual basis, as not only are they profitable on the job itself, but how much are they contributing or giving back to the overall entity? And that we would call a contribution factor. So I'm spending 70% of the money that's in the job to get the job done, and it's contributing back to my overall business 30%. And then within that 30%, it covers a lot of your fixed costs and overhead. And then, of course, hopefully you've strategized in such a way that you have a decent profit that comes with that. That's one way to do it. The other way to attribute those expenses is you can take your your macro expenses, if you want to really break your company down to a job by job basis, you can take your macro expenses and allocate them based on your labor hours to each project. So if this certain project has 11% of your total man hours for the month, then you allocate 11% of your overhead, of your various administrative things that you really don't have a bucket to put them in, so that you can identify job costing. And this is one of the big questions we always get on job costing is people say, well, I can job cost the individual job, but what about all my other expenses? So right now I'm giving you two different options of how to do that. One is you do a contribution factor back to the macro, and the other is you take those expenses and you allocate them across the board to your projects based on the percentage of man hours that you've put to each project. Let me know, Derek, how that comes across to you. Does that make sense to you as we're talking about that?
Yeah, ultimately, sum it up. If you've got 5 projects going in the month of August, and on each project you have 10 employees, then you would take your overhead cost, split them up 20% to each project, because they all have the same amount of manpower, same amount of man hours. But if there were 3 of the 5 projects that had 80% of your employees and they were all distributed evenly, then 80% of your overhead costs need to go to those 3 projects, and then 10% would go to the other 2 that had only 10% of the employees. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's correct. And basically in that analogy, as though everything were equal, right? Because it's not so much about how many employees were there, but it's about how many man hours, because you might have all your employees on one project for a week and then you've got them distributed differently. So if you're using, like, of course, that's why we started with tracking time, because that was the most important job cost to track is your man hours. If you're using BusyBusy and you're tracking your man hours, you can see how much of a percentage of your man hours goes to one project versus another, and you can allocate your expenses that way. Here's the weakness of that way of tracking, okay? That way of tracking works fantastic during high times. And when you're busy, it just works good. It, maybe even better than usual, okay? But let's say you've got a company and then you're short on work, and so your manpower isn't busy, all your available capacity isn't being used. So you have capacity of your manpower to work, 4 weeks, but really you're only lining them up with 3 weeks worth of work because you're new in business, you're small, or times are tight. That's where the weakness of that comes, because then all your administrative cost is hitting those projects, hitting that 3 weeks worth of projects. And so it becomes a much more difficult burden for them to bear.
Yeah. So if in slow times, is the better way to do is to allocate those costs per day. So on days that you have 75% of your labor force working, but there's a day that 25 is sitting, that's accounted for in the costing that day, and that those costs for your machines and everything else that you're paying leases on, your building overhead, everything else, you're allocating those daily. Is that the solution? Because it's great that you tell us why there's a problem, but what's a better way to do it?
The better way to do it, and the way that handles slow time better, is to jump back to the alternative way I said to track, which is contribution. And so what you're doing is you want to allow people to win on the project, right? So you identify how much money it takes for the project to just basically pay for itself. And that's your labor, your materials, everything that's going into that project to get the project accomplished. And everything beyond that is just a contribution to the overall overhead and administrative costs of the company. So let's say in this case, instead of having $100,000 for a project, you had $80,000, but $70,000 is still your cost of the project. Instead of contributing $30,000, it's now only contributing $10,000. The great thing about that, when you're in slower times or when you're starting a business, is it gets you really quick a realization of how much money that you've got to run the administrative side of your company. And so you might have to tighten up your administrative tighter. If your projects can't contribute enough based on the market rate and what it costs to the general or overhead administrative costs of the company, then you have to make changes in your administration. You have to make changes. You have to tighten your belt. You have to become more lean, especially on your operations and overhead, in order to not come in a negative every month.
Got it. So one other question, just to clarify, if there's any additional context you can add here. I'm sure there are people who are watching this who are thinking a similar thing to what I was thinking. You mentioned larger companies are really good at macroeconomics. Smaller companies tend to be good at microeconomics, but sometimes miss on the macro. You have to be good at micro to be good at macro, but you don't necessarily have to be good at macro to be good at micro, correct? I mean, how could you be good at macroeconomics if your microeconomics on a per project basis are off?
You can be. So the reason bigger companies can do so well at macro, they can still be profitable, and they can't be terrible at their microeconomics, but if they're really good at their macroeconomics and they're, let's call it, mediocre at their microeconomics, they can still make a good amount of money, because you basically, a good way I would say to think about this is, of your overall profit you make in a company, let's assume or hope you're making 20% profit margin. If you run your company right, about 10% or half that profit margin is coming from your microeconomics, and the other 10% or another half is coming from your macroeconomics. And so it's how you're managing your business on a macro level is producing at least half your profits, and how you're managing on a micro level, or your performance is producing about half your profits. And it's something that takes business as well to learn. And so when they're good at one and not the other, they're simply losing that opportunity. It goes back to that, a lot of cash covers up a lot of sins. They're losing the opportunity to make double the profits that they could be making, or that they are making.
Gotcha. And then the other side, the microeconomics and being good there, but not at the macro. A really easy example of this that I saw. I built a GC my own home a couple years ago, and the electrician that worked on the home, he ended up buying BusyBusy after he had been there a couple days on the job. We were just chatting one of the days after work, and I had a really good relationship with him. So about 6 months later, we released a new feature in our product called progress tracking that measures work accomplished. So I called him up as a buddy and just said, "Hey, dude, this is in beta. Do you want to check this out? I think this would be something that would really help your business." And he's a really good electrician. One of the best subs I had on my job, ran really great with his employees and everything else. But it was interesting, his response, where he said, "Hey, I don't even do job costing because I'm so busy and my guys are on so many different projects a day that I don't even have them attributing time to a project," which was really surprising to me, because he's a good contractor, extremely good at what he does from an actual execution and trade standpoint. But you could see the lack of macroeconomics in a way that resource scheduling was a major problem for him. There were days where he'd have 2 guys on the job and then flex to 6 or 8 and then back down to 2. He'd have guys there in the morning and then leave in the afternoon. But it wasn't because of constraints that they couldn't get any more done. It was just overcommitting to too many GCs and other situations, in a way that there was a lot of travel costs and a lot of other incurred costs and opportunity costs that were being missed, where he didn't have guys in front of a wall long enough. So we did a webinar about a year ago with a CFO out of Wisconsin, who I met at World of Concrete a couple years back, because he'd sent me an email after, I think, about 9 months of using BusyBusy, and said, "Hey, just wanted to tell you this has gone better than we thought that it would. BusyBusy is going to make us $1 million this year." And this is an 80-employee company making $1 million. So obviously I had to go, okay, tell me more about that. So I jumped on a call, wanted to hear about it, told him we got to do a webinar about this. But what they did from a job costing standpoint, and again, this was macro, is what they wanted to do is they said, we're losing too much time that is non-labor time. So they created a bucket where they started resource allocating time to, when are you on a job and when are you not? And if you're on a job making money, we want to see what percentage of total employees are in front of a wall doing work versus time that they are loading their trucks, getting materials at the shop, traveling. And they realized 50% of their time was being spent on non-labor. So you've got all these skilled laborers, expensive, and they were spending 50% of their time, 50% of their payroll. Payroll is your largest cost. It's your largest variable cost on top of that. And 50% of that time was spent doing things that weren't making the company money. So he had said what they were able to do is they were able to shift that down. If I remember right, this was over a year ago. They were able to reduce that by 20%, which saved them $500,000. And then that 20% that they were able to increase on time in front of a wall, time doing labor, increased their profit by another $500,000. So there's $1 million there, $1 million in savings and $1 million in increased production, or 500,000 of each, that allowed them to make $1 million in the first 12 months of implementation by just basic macroeconomic job costing.
It's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, for sure. They pay, BusyBusy peanuts, right? $10,000 or less for the year, and they make $1 million doing it, because all BusyBusy did was help them understand what was happening in their job or in their company. And so they took that data and they applied it on macro level and said, okay, look, here's where on a big level we're losing a lot of money. And this is what I was saying earlier when I said big companies are typically good at macro and little companies are good at micro. And that's not the only thing. There's a lot of other aspects to those two divisions of micro versus macro. But it's the same thing that that video I showed you earlier on that project that was going really slow. They were good on a macro level, but they weren't taking care of the project on a micro level. Anybody watching this project that's a good supervisor is going to say, oh my gosh, I would have done better than that. Of course I would have done better than that. Yeah, you would have. And many people would have. But why was that company still profitable? Because they were doing great on a macro level, but not so great on a micro level. And when you can bring those two things into balance, and of course, getting your data in place helps you bring those things into balance. It's amazing the kind of profits you can unlock. And it doesn't even surprise me that an 80 employee company could unlock $1 million in profits in a year. That's not even a surprise to me.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, as far as BusyBusy, I mean, we are designed pricing wise to be able to do that, right? You pay $5,000 for employee, $10 to be able to attribute their time to jobs, understand job costing. It's designed that way intentionally so that price is not a barrier to increase efficiency, because that's what we're really trying to do. All right, let's move on. Next topic here. How to prepare for a downturn. Now, here's the thing with this. I understand some people on here are saying, I don't think there's going to be a recession in my area based on construction. Again, I qualify it with construction because we know that technically the nation is in a recession, but does that impact construction? You can hear a million things from a million different people on this, a lot of different opinions. I was out to dinner with my family a couple of weeks ago at a hibachi grill. I was sitting next to a lath and plaster guy, owns a company, 200 employees. And his comment to me as we were sitting there chatting was, there's two types of contractors in the US right now. There's those who know a recession is coming and those who are going out of business. That's a pretty polarizing statement. You don't have to agree with it. I'm not saying that's my stance. There's another guy, he's an electrician I was talking to just the other day, ran into him, and I asked him how work was going for him because he's been using our product for about 7 years now. And he said, things are perfect. He's like, honestly, the tiny bit of slowdown is the best thing that happened to me, because for the last 3 years, I've been chasing myself in a way that I couldn't keep up. He's like, I finally can breathe and I'm keeping up a little bit. So for him, he's at a good pace. He doesn't think that there's going to be some cliff. In 2008, it was a cliff. There were a lot of people who had slowed down before it all of a sudden just dropped off. And so I think that's the part that we want to really address is it's, okay, if things are slowing down a little bit in your area, what do you do with that slowdown? How are you conscious of it? How do you prepare to ensure that there is not a cliff in your business? And if there is a cliff in your region as far as a recession and something more dramatic happens, what do you do during those times? How do you continue to button up? Because more than anything, addressing this topic, I think the reason that we can safely address it is if you're a good company and you do a couple things better, you're only going to become a great company. And And if you're a good company and you don't make a couple adjustments and make preparation, then you could become a company that struggles and has more financial problems than you probably could have had. So Isaac, if you want to jump into that, talk a little bit more about how to do that, what you saw, what your recommendations are, what you and your construction companies are doing over the next 6 months to a year to continue to prep for what's going on economically.
Yeah, it's a fantastic topic. And of course, I'm very passionate about it because I did go through and survive a major downturn, and it was extremely rough. But the thing I'll say, and you stated this, and I'll just kind of restate it, is it's never a bad idea to get your company in order, get your shit in order. That is never a bad idea. You're going to make more profits. You're going to have better peace of mind. You're going to run a better company if you'll get your stuff in order. And, you think of it like, old movies we watch where, they're on a ship out to sea or out on the ocean, and it's like a storm is coming, batten down the hatches, put things in order, make sure everything's secure on the ship. That's what you do. You make sure that you're prepared for a storm coming. And then if the storm doesn't come or it passes by and you don't end up having as much of a downturn as you think you're having, great. Nobody's hurt. And this is what personally I advocate no lose situations. I want to be, as a business owner, I want to put myself in a no lose position. So whether there's a downturn or not, I want to run my business better, and I want to be prepared. And if it comes, I'm prepared. And if it doesn't come, I just make more profit. So a couple things to help you understand, things that you can do. One is, just understanding your business. And I advocate this real heavily, but you need to know who your team is and who your A players are. Now, I believe this in general management, downturn or not. You need to understand who your key players are, and you need to make sure that your business has an A plan, a B plan, and a C plan. And so I'm going to give you this in this terms. Make sure you understand what is your minimum staff you want to have to run your business. In other words, if you had less work than you have today, who would you let go of? Who would you lay off, and who would you keep? You want to make sure that's very clear in your business, because what can happen is you can end up having these, you can end up losing your key players, downturn or not. You can lose them just because you're not paying attention to them. And so you really need to identify that. Who is your key players? Who are your money makers within your company, your A players? That should be what your first thought is if I have 50 employees, and of my 50 employees, let's say I have, I'll be overly optimistic. Let's say I have 20 A players, okay, 30 A players, whatever the case is. I need to identify those, because that's where I want to be able to shrink my company to, in the event that I lose half my work or a bunch of work, or whatever the case is. I want to shrink down to my A players. Why is that so important? Well, first off, going back to a lot of cash covers up a lot of sins. When you're in a high economy and you have a hard time finding labor staff, which we have today, we have a hard time finding skilled workers, then prices end up getting higher because people work less efficient. And so, and because there's so much work needed and there's such a low supply of skilled workers, then we end up having to price according to the lesser efficient workers. We're not necessarily making less profits, because we're basically pushing that onto the market. You know what I'm saying? We're basically pushing those inefficiencies onto the market. And so let's assume, we'll call it 1 through 10. Let's say I'm getting a 10 for my pricing. You could call it 100,000, because I have inefficient workers. And so maybe I'm making a 10% margin on my company, which is acceptable. If you get into low times and you have half the jobs and you have to back down your pricing, let's say to a 7, so you're getting 30% less for your projects. And this is very possible. This can absolutely happen. If you don't think this can happen, you haven't been around long enough. We're getting 30% more for projects than we were a couple of years ago. You can absolutely get 30% less. And so when you retreat down to those lower prices, if you want to preserve your profit margins and protect the profitability of your company, you have to maintain those A players, because those are your more efficient workers, and they can help you be profitable in lean times because they're higher producers. They're going to get the work accomplished faster and execute it faster. So you really should have 3 different staff considerations. One is your minimum staff. One is your optimum staff. Minimum means, worst case scenario, I get down to this much people. This is what I need to run my business effectively. Optimum is you're saying, hey, these are my best team members. These who produce the best money. This is where I would like to be. This is where I make the most profit per employee. That's your optimum staff. And then you have your maximum staff, which is here's the maximum amount of people that I can manage and be effective as a company, or that my resources and my system, my internal systems and structures can manage. You should always have that very clear in your company, your minimum, your optimum, and your maximum staff. And you can call it A, B, and C plans if you want, but that's you should have. And then when you're thinking about a recession, if you're thinking about that coming, you need to do two things real importantly. Number one, understand your fixed costs, your fixed expenses that you have as a business. We talked about that earlier, your administrative expenses. This can be your rent. This can be, equipment payments, truck payments, all kinds of different things you have. This is money that your company has to pay, whether you're working or not. Like you need to understand the money that your company has to pay out, whether it is working or not, and make sure that's really clear to you. Okay. So that you can be back down to that. And then start producing a savings. And when you're producing your savings, and all companies should have this, it is a cash savings. You can call it a rainy day fund or whatever you want to call it, but you should first have enough savings to be able to last yourself 1 month. Okay. And then move that to 3 months, and then move that to 6 months. And there's two different things you're considering in your savings. One is my minimum cash expenses that have to go out whether I work or not. Okay, that is one of your considerations in your savings. And the other big consideration is my payroll. If I get into a position where I want to keep my people, that I feel like I'm weathering a storm, but even my revenue coming in slows down, whatever the case may be, how much payroll do I have in savings to give me time to make good decisions? If it feels like we fall off a cliff, right? Do I immediately just lay everybody off? Or do I stop and think and analyze the market and decide where I feel like the market is going? Can we repurpose our staff? Can we put them to work and doing different things? All those considerations can be made if you've allocated or put away the rainy day savings. And when times are good, like they've been in the last couple of years, companies should have been doing that. And if they haven't been doing that, they should start doing that. Try to get yourself to 1 month, 3 months, 6 months of your fixed costs. This is the money you pay out with or without operations of the company. And then try to get yourself to 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months of payroll, the cost of your payroll in savings, so that you can actually manage your company in a downturn. And those, I would say, are some of your most important things. There are other factors involved, and I know we're running short in time. We could probably have a whole seminar or a whole webinar just on preparing for a downturn. The way you diversify your projects and your customer base, and also how you diversify the projects that you're going after and how you're bidding your projects. All those are factors, but I know we're running short on time here.
Yep. Yeah. I'm going to add one thing to this. You said it at the very beginning. I think it's worth restating, which is you can't afford to lose money, whether it's taking a job that you're going to lose a ton of money. Now, there's an exception to every rule. If it's an educated loss where you're saying, hey, this is going to keep my A players busy enough that I can take a loss of 5% rather than a much larger loss of keeping them on payroll without, then do it, but do it educatedly. But I was listening to a podcast last week, and it was a financial podcast. And one of the things that the guy was pointing out is exactly that. The man himself had just written a financial book. He was on this podcast talking about it, but he talked about how he had the opportunity to interview Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and all of these different very successful investors, hedge fund managers, and all of this stuff. And he said every single one of them, their very first rule is never take a loss. Because if you have $100,000 and you lose $50,000, well, in his example is if you lose 50%, if you lose 50% of an investment, now you're down to 50,000. You don't make 50% to get it back to even. You have to make 100%. So the second that you're taking losses because you're not prepared, again, unless it's an educated loss and you know exactly why you're taking it, you're putting yourself at a deficit that is much, much harder to come back from than staying neutral. So, yeah, You have $100,000 there, you lose 50% of it, you're going to have to make 100% back in your next investment to get it back. Business works the exact same way. So let's be really, really aware of what those losses would do to the business. And we've got some questions coming in, so I want to jump to those. One of the questions right off the top is, what accounting softwares do what accounting softwares does BusyBusy work with? All accounting softwares, any accounting software that's out there that accepts an import, which I've never seen any accounting software that doesn't. Everything imports into, exports out of, so they work really, really well. There are a handful of them that there's fully built out integrations where projects and everything go into it, and those are covered as well. Next question, as a company, we've been wanting to implement cost codes. What steps would you recommend taking in order to do this and make it stick? So Isaac, I'm going to take a stab at this because we've had the opportunity to help a lot of contractors do this. In fact, there's a fantastic story that I think you guys will appreciate, because sometimes it's easier to know something's a good idea than to do it in your own business. So I have been at BusyBusy for 5.5 years, and about 2 years ago, Isaac called me and said, hey, we have an investor who invested 7-8 years ago. So at this point, it's been about 10 years since he had invested, and he invested in BusyBusy because he loved the idea, understood how important it was, but he himself, concrete company, about 40 employees, has never rolled BusyBusy out because he's scared his employees wouldn't do it. So it's funny because why would you invest in something that you don't want to do in your own business? But in this case, he came in, sat down with me, great guy, runs a very successful business. Right off the top, just sat down and said, okay, I cannot do paper anymore. He's like, I am losing so much money, the opportunity cost, how many hours it takes our field staff, our office staff, like we can't do paper anymore. You got to help me. So he wanted to go from 0 to 100. The thing that I would recommend is not doing that. It's very much a step-by-step process. What I helped him do, and again, this was a concrete company, but what I helped him do is I said, okay, we're going to do this in stages. So what we first did was we imported all his projects into BusyBusy, and then we set up cost codes. And I said, okay, what we want to do is we're going to create 4 buckets. And the first 3 are the things that your employees spend most of their time doing. And then the 4th is an other. So that you're not, because the mistake that you see often companies make is they decide they want to do cost codes, and they roll out 50 cost codes and they never get adoption because people don't see the value in it. And once you're attributing time to the wrong thing, or you're not attributing time with a cost code, the estimators won't use the information. So it just becomes this cyclical mess of bad information. And if you're getting bad information in, bad information's coming out, it's not improving anything. So what we did with this concrete company is we set up a prep, which was your forms, your rebar, everything that way. And then we set up a pour, and then we set up a cleanup, and then there was an other bucket. Now we could have done a lot more. We talked about, should we do, because I think it is really important in this case, we'll stick with concrete, to do something like tying rebar and setting up forms, because you'll realize with the flat work, some guys are just better at certain parts of it than others. So once you can get into tracking how much time is going into tying rebar and setting up forms on a job, you can start to see where people really, really thrive and are most efficient. But for him, it had taken him so long to get into my office when he's known about BusyBusy and so long that I just did not want to complicate it in any way. So we kept it extremely, extremely simple, had him come back 6 months later. Then we implemented forms, rebar, couple extra things, expanded out to about 6 things, still had an other bucket. Because the cool thing about the other bucket is it gives you an opportunity to start seeing, because guys can put the notes in there to see what they're doing and saying, okay, most of our time in the other bucket is being spent on this. Let's start tracking that. So if you're a waterproofer, same thing, you'll start to see where time should be attributed that you're not tracking time to. But Start with 3 or 4 cost codes, have another bucket, have them just write in the description field where else they're spending the time, and you'll get great adoption. You'll be able to start seeing information. And the more information you see and the guys in the field see you using it, the more information you'll be able to give. And then where you can really empower is when you get the information and you can start bonusing off of the information that you're gathering. Anything you'd add to that, Isaac?
Excuse me. I think it's a perfect response. I think you do have to make it simple up front because you're fighting the change more than anything, getting your employees to learn to clock into cost codes. And so the only thing I would add is when you're implementing cost codes in your company, be clear with yourself on what your end result is that you're after. And I would advocate that your typical end result you're after is to collect the right data to show the estimator whether they did the job right or whether they didn't. Like you said, at breaking out those different positions or the main tasks that someone's working on, if those are the things that the estimator is making assumptions on when they're bidding a project, typically it's certain tasks and how long it takes to do those tasks, and that's how they're pulling their data together. That's where I would focus. Take your big bucket items from your estimator. If you're going to start with 2 or 3, ask them what are the 2 or 3 most important things you'd like validation on. And then I love, Derek, that you put the other in there. If the estimator says, hey, if I just really understood the pouring and the rebar, the rest stuff I can just assume for a while, then start with those 2 cost codes and give the other bucket and just, take it step by step. And then, make sure you have your end goal in mind of where you want to get to give your estimator the data that they need so that they can become a better estimator to get you the most money out of your jobs.
Yeah. Let's a couple other questions, then we got to go because we don't want to keep people too long. Another question is, okay, let's go with this one here. And I apologize, some of these questions we won't be able to get to, but this one, Isaac, I'll let you go ahead and answer. It's, how much time would you estimate it would take me, being a mid-sized company, to implement job costing and keep it maintained? And in your opinion, do I need to have another administrative staff person to be able to help execute that?
Okay, so I'll answer the last part of that question first, which is job costing is worth the additional administrator if you're a mid-sized company, and I'm assuming mid-sized means they're in the 30 to 50 employee range. But if you start job costing your company, you're going to make more money than that additional person. I don't know whether you need them or not, but I would say they're worth it if that's what it takes for you to implement job costing. And job costing is a habit change within your company. So just like we talked about cost codes, I would start off by job costing per job, because if right now you don't know where your jobs even cost out at, you're just tracking your company overall, or so let's say month to month. The first thing you do is start costing by job so that you can see whether you're winning or losing on each individual jobs. And then do like we talked earlier and put that additional layer of the cost codes, put in the ones that are the most important, and then slowly grow them to the point that you get the information that the estimator needs, and try really hard to keep it simple. But again, that administrator, what they're really going to be managing for the most part is change management. They're going to be changing habits within your company. So if I was looking to hire that administrator, I'd be looking to hire someone with great communication skills, because that's going to be the key. They're going to be following up and following up and following up as you try to produce that change within your company.
Cool. Okay. We are 10 after the hour, so we better get going. Thanks so much. Seriously appreciate everybody attending. Appreciate a bunch of the questions. We do have some staff here that will email you and respond to a bunch of the other questions that came in. We do have this recorded as well, so we will be making a recording, sending it out to you. If there's any additional questions that you have or suggestions that you're looking for on how BusyBusy can help you with job costing or any other software, really, it's like, please don't waste your time on paper, and don't spend time in places that you can have technology automate for you. And have a great rest of your week, and enjoy the crazy August summer as you guys continue to wrap up the busy summer season that you're having. Best of luck.
Thanks, everyone.